A to Z Mysteries, Book Number 19, The School Skeleton, by Ron Roy. Chapter 9. Green Lawn Elementary didn't have a cafeteria. All the kids brought their lunches from home. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose took their bags outside and sat on the swings in the sun. A lot of other kids came out to eat too. "Tuna fish," Josh said, smelling his sandwich. "What have you guys got?" Ruth Rose peeked inside her plastic bag. "Bologna and a cheese," she said. Dink's sandwich turned out to be egg salad. "Who wants to trade?" he asked. "I'll take the egg," Ruth Rose said. "I want the bologna and cheese," Josh said. "Good," Dink said. "I wanted the tuna." The kids swapped sandwiches and began eating. "A kid from each class in the school found a key in a drawing," Dink said after he'd swallowed his first bite. "So there are 6 keys and 6 drawings and 6 footprints," Josh said around a mouthful of sandwich. Ruth Rose shook her head. "Now every class is trying to find Miss Shotsky's skeleton before anyone else does," she sighed. "That's about 100 kids." 2 small boys walked past, looking for a place to eat their lunches. One of the boys carried a drawing of a skeleton. "Even the little kindergartners," Josh wailed, kicking some sand. "It's not fair." "I just thought of something," Ruth Rose said. "There's a door that connects Mr. Dillon's office to the nurse's office. He could have snuck in when Miss Shotsky wasn't there and taken the skeleton." "It would take him only a couple of minutes," Josh said. "Guys, I thought we already decided the snatcher couldn't be Mr. Dillon," Dink said. "He wasn't wearing sneakers." "But he could easily have taken Mrs. Waters' powder," Ruth Rose reminded him. "The powder, the door to the nurse's office, everything else points to Mr. Dillon." "But why would the school principal steal the school skeleton?" Dink asked. "He's the one offering the reward for finding Mr. Bones." Josh balled up his lunch bag. "Let's go see Mrs. Waters again. Maybe she's remembered where she saw that zigzag sneaker sole." The kids hurried into the school and headed for the principal's office. "Let's leave our lunch stuff," Dink said, stopping at his locker. They opened their locker doors and put their lunch bags inside. They found Mrs. Waters sitting at her desk with a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up when the kids walked in. "This school has gone wacky," she said. "First, Miss Shotsky's skeleton disappears, then I start losing things. I've been searching for my closet key for 2 days. Whatever will be next." "You're missing a key?" Josh asked, already digging in his pocket. "Yes, I haven't been able to put my purse and coat in the closet," Mrs. Waters said. Josh found the skeleton drawing wrapped around the key. He removed the paper and put the key on Mrs. Waters' desk. "Is this it?" Mrs. Waters picked up the key and examined it. "No, this isn't the one I lost." "Could it be a copy of your key?" Dink asked. "I suppose." Mrs. Waters looked at Dink. "Why would anyone take my key and make a copy? Where did you find it, Josh?" "In my locker," he said, "along with this." He showed Mrs. Waters the picture of the skeleton. "A key and a skeleton," she said. "What does it mean?" "We think the key leads to the skeleton," Ruth Rose said. "So it might be in your closet." "My closet? Who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Waters stood up and marched over to her coat closet. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose followed her. Mrs. Waters inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door slowly swung open. Hanging from Mrs. Waters' coat hook was the school skeleton. Mr. Bones had a big grin on his face. "It's Mr. Bones!" Ruth Rose screamed. Chapter 10. Mr. Dillon came flying out of his office. "What's the matter?" Before Mrs. Waters could answer, Miss Shotsky burst into the little room. Who screamed? Anyone hurt? Miss Shatsky cried, looking first at the three kids. Are you kids all right? Yes, and here's your friend, Miss Shatsky. Mrs. Waters pulled the closet door all the way open. Well, for heaven's sake, Miss Shatsky exclaimed. And what's this? She removed a folded paper that had been taped to the skeleton's hand. She read it out loud. April Fools. They all burst out laughing. Someone has been playing a trick on the whole school, Mrs. Waters said. Well, Mr. Bones is going back where he belongs, Miss Shatsky said. She lifted the school skeleton off the hook. Say bye-bye, she said, waving the skeleton's hand. Then she carried it into her office. Mrs. Waters went to her desk. She looked at her calendar. Today is April Fool's Day, she said. It totally slipped my mind. She carried her coat to the closet. She placed it on the hook, then bent down and picked something up off the closet floor. When she turned around, she was holding a pair of sneakers. She turned them over so everyone could see the bottoms. Zigzag Chads, Josh said. Are those the sneakers that everyone's been talking about? Mr. Dillon said. How did they get in your coat closet, Mrs. Waters? Mrs. Waters stared at her boss for a moment, then shook her head. I have no idea, Mr. Dillon. Excuse me, I think I know, Dink said. Mr. Dillon looked at Dink. The lights glinted off his eyeglasses. You do? Tell us, Dink. Dink blushed. Well, someone decided to play an April Fool's Day joke on the whole school. So he took Miss Shatsky's skeleton and hid it in Mrs. Waters' closet. Dink looked at Mrs. Waters. He took your key so you wouldn't be able to open the door. But why would this person hide his sneakers? Mr. Dillon asked. Because he left a footprint, Josh said, and he planned to make more footprints later. And he borrowed Mrs. Waters' powder to do it with, Ruth Rose said, grinning at Dink and Josh. He took the key somewhere and had 6 copies made, Dink went on. He drew 6 skeletons and left them and the keys in 6 different lockers, one for each classroom. Mr. Dillon shook his head. Amazing! Why would he do such a thing? I think he wanted all the kids to search for the skeleton, Dink said. I'm confused, Mr. Dillon said. He sat in Mrs. Waters' chair. How could some stranger come into the school and do all this without being seen? Dink glanced at Josh and Ruth Rose. They both nodded. We think it was someone who works here, sir, Dink said. One of the teachers? Mr. Dillon said. But who? And why? Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose looked at Mr. Dillon. They kept staring until the principal blushed. Oh my goodness, Mrs. Waters cried. It was you, wasn't it? Caught, Mr. Dillon said, grinning. But you wanted to get caught, Ruth Rose said. That's why you left footprints and keys and notes. Mr. Dillon nodded. Yes, I wanted to get caught. You see, I love April Fool's Day. When I was your age, I couldn't wait for this day. I played pranks all the time. I did it too, Mrs. Waters said. My sister was always finding frogs in her sweater drawer. No one plays tricks or pranks anymore, Mr. Dillon went on. Each year, April 1st just slips by unnoticed. So I decided that this year would be different. This year, everyone would remember April Fool's Day. Mr. Dillon kicked off his loafers and pulled on the zigzag sneakers. I've missed these, he said. I wear them to school every morning, then change to my loafers. Dink laughed. We went around measuring teachers' feet, and all the time those sneakers were in the closet. The principal grinned. I have to admit, I had a lot of fun. On Monday, I went in to wash my hands at Miss Shatsky's sink. It was early. No one was here. Then I saw the skeleton with her scarf draped around its shoulders, and that's when I got the idea." His eyes twinkled. "I grabbed the skeleton, came back through our connecting door, and hid it in Mrs. Waters' closet. She leaves the key in the lock, so I just locked the door and kept the key." "Then you changed your shoes, right?" Josh asked. Mr. Dillon nodded. "I didn't realize I'd left a footprint, but when you told me that later, I decided to leave more footprints, and that's when I borrowed Mrs. Waters' powder." "And I expect it back, please," she said. Everyone laughed again. Mr. Dillon smiled. "Since you three kids were the first to find Mr. Bones, you get to make the announcement over the intercom." "What announcement?" Bink asked. "Why, about the trip, of course. I've hired buses to take the entire school to the aquarium," Mr. Dillon said. "Everyone is going?" asked Ruth Rose. "Everyone searched for Mr. Bones, so everyone gets the prize," said Mr. Dillon. Suddenly, Mr. Bones's head popped through the connecting door. "Even me?" the skeleton asked.